No.
The lady in the pink over here?
Oh, yeah.
Another thing is religion, you say, can be helpful to a society, but most people to follow a religion follow some kind of text, which is translated by man.
Correct. Well, I mean,
So how can a religion be helpful to society when the message, the first message of a religion isn't necessarily true, because it could be altered or changed because of man's fallacies?
yeah, but I mean, one has to therefore understand how many sort of different interpretations you can get from a translation. Remember, the people who first translated the King James Bible, one of the reasons it's such a beautiful translation is because they said, if I got one damn word wrong, God will be holding me accountable. Of course, now you have translations that can do everything, but I think the limitations on translation, I think you might be overplaying it. The Septuagint, I think you can get pretty accurate translations of that. God has to speak in some language, right?
Yeah, but even then, God passed down his message to people.
But
And
see,
then people told his message to others.
Right,
It's
but-
like the rumor game. If you whisper in one person's ear one thing, by the time it gets to somebody else, it could be completely different.
Right, but the idea is, if you're talking about God and the message, you know, God's powerful enough to make sure the message gets translated accurately. See, the idea is, in the rumor game, it's nice because we're all humans, and then what ends up there is just different from what starts. But if you're talking about an omnipresent, omniscient, omnipotent God, if he wants the text translated in a certain way, he'll make sure that the people who do the translating will get it right. I mean, that would be, I think, the religious understanding, right? That it's just, you know, the translation. Now, of course, the question you raise, of course, is the huge one about, you know, the nature of revelation. Did the prophet get it right?
Yeah.
One argument would simply say, well, God will make sure the prophet got it right.
A false prophet.
Right, and then that's the other question as well. Someone like Spinoza, who would simply say the only possibility of knowing if a prophet got it right is for the prophet to actually perform a miracle, and therefore you begin in Spinoza and others exactly what you're talking about, the thing called the higher criticism of the biblical text, to show that they're different authors, different time frames they were done it. But I think you could say that the authentic religious person would say, you know, if God, you know, feels it necessary, he'll make sure he gets it right. You know, that's not an inherent problem.
Let's go over here and begin with that issue.
Jim, I'm probably sure. If a person examines a sacred text and thinks it through, reasons it out, and concludes that he wants to embrace it, how is that then unreasonable?
As long as the moral, well, it goes back to Brian's point, that you have to make that independent determination that everything in there is true and just. And if the text says, you know, go around killing people, discriminating, or oppressing those who disagree, well then I would say, well then you're not using your reason, you're not using your moral sense. And so for me, that would fall somewhere in between pure spirituality and religious fundamentalism. Or you could even, I would even say that people can be members of mainstream religions and be spiritual if they're not dogmatic about it, if they're not, you know, what I call fundamentalists about it, what many psychologists would call fundamentalism. And as long as you're not so sure that you think that that should be imposed on others. So yeah, you can be spiritual based on the sacred text without being fundamental.
Gentlemen in the process.
So, all right, for Dr. Frost, the way you had presented your argument, the whole deal was a kind of respect or fear for the rules presented by God, or what keeps the society in check. But in this day and age, we can kind of see a whole lot of more industrialized societies are becoming more agnostic, kind of more spiritual, as Swanson had put it. And there seems to be a bit more reverence towards, you know, good and humanitarianism and things like that, as they are without respects to God. In a sense, all those things pass, or things that transcend human nature, like goodness and giving and things like that, are kind of becoming their own focus for pseudo-religion in society today. How do you see that turning out if we keep going down that path?
Could you show me these stellar examples of modern humanitarianism?
Well, for things like Japan, for instance, a lot of people are giving to the aid in Japan because they simply think that's the thing that's needs to be done. That's the good thing to do. It's not necessarily because God commands them.
No, but if you're talking about genuine humanitarianism, I mean, just look at the 20th and 21st century, and it's just a failed disaster. I mean, we could have stopped the Rwandan genocide in 5 seconds, failed to do it. Could have stopped the war in Yugoslavia, the ethnic cleansing.
And I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that's the
So
thing.
I can keep going with humanitarian. The claim that there is this new humanitarianism that is somehow taking over the world, I think is utterly false. I mean, just look at this. I mean, it took us, what, 3.5 weeks to even begin to think about a no-fly zone over one of the most brutal dictators in Libya? I mean, so I just think the humanitarianism that you might be speaking about that's arising without religion, I really wonder whether or not it's just more words rather than real action. But maybe I'm not getting your question quite right.
Well, I think the thing is, some of the things that we could have prevented or we should have prevented due to humanitarianism are things that are out of control. For things that we can help, like tsunami relief and things like that, we've been giving and we've been trying to do all we can. For things that deal with a political nature, like Libya or Rwanda or things like that, it's harder for societies as a whole to do something about it because the people who are pushing that sort of spirituality, I should say, aren't in control. They're not in the position to kind of make that sort of change.
But see, I think I disagree with your first point, whether or not what you're talking about is genuine humanitarianism. I mean, certainly people may be giving money for tsunami relief. But I mean, just think about the Hurricane Katrina situation. I mean, who is still down here building homes for people in Mississippi and Louisiana? By and large, it's Christian groups. So, I mean, it's okay to give $10, $20 for humanitarians, but when we talk about genuine humanitarian, someone who's actually going to sacrifice themselves, people who come down here, I think we would say the religious people, by and large, do what you could call the genuine humanitarian work. I mean, it's one thing to make a sort of one-time contribution and feel good about yourself, but it may be that isn't what one would really call humanitarianism, but just a sort of small act of generosity. But it just seems like I'm not sure that increasingly industrial and, as you said, agnostic or maybe less religious societies have really given the lie to whether or not we can, will, or are in the process at present of somehow being able to be genuinely what used to be called, a good Christian neighbor without the Christianity, or a good religious neighbor without the religion.
Well, I think, I'm not going to claim that we're any more humanitarian or less humanitarian now than in the past, but as far as the point that, like the European democracies, in 2005, the EU Commission, an EU Commission did a religious survey of EU member states, and here are the EU member states or possible member states where belief in God is less than half of the population now. They asked if I believe there's a God, or I believe there's some sort of spirit or life force, more spiritual than religion by my definition, or I don't believe there's any sort of spirit, God, or life force. And belief in God is now less than half of the population in Lithuania, Germany, Luxembourg, Hungary, Belgium, Finland, Great Britain, Latvia, Slovenia, France, Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, the Czech Republic, Estonia, Croatia, Bulgaria, Switzerland, Iceland, and Norway. I don't think these are tyrannical states, and that's my point. These seem to be flourishing democracies without having a majority of the population believe in some monotheistic God, as Bryan defined it.
The future is gone.
Future's unknown.
I know, we'll see what
Future
happens.
doesn't exist yet.
But put this way, I wonder how humanitarian those states are. They certainly weren't very humanitarian.
Gentleman in the blue shirt, and then you do this.
Go ahead. Good question, thank you.
Okay. Pass me that, okay, for now. All right. I'm looking forward.
I apologize, I don't know your name.
Swanson.
Swanson, Professor Swanson. I find your spectrum to be peculiar, if not problematic, for two particular reasons, maybe even three. One, when you talk about reason being on the side of pure spirituality, I find that contradictory to what seems to be the status quo amongst most people who do claim a sort of pure spirituality, non-affiliation with a religion, where what you have amongst them is an incredibly broad spectrum there of what they believe is right and wrong. You give into more pop psychology would be a popular term for it, to pop spirituality, where it's sort of what you believe is right, and there seems to be very little agreement amongst most people who ascribe to
We'll call
that.
this cool relativism.
Specifically, it gives rise to relativism. Furthermore, I think that the two are not necessarily linked when you look specifically at, let's say, the French Revolution on the tail end of the Enlightenment, which championed reason and gave in to it established a religion of reason where they worshiped the goddess of reason, and it's one of the darkest times in European history pre-World War II, Furthermore, when you move on to the opposite side of the spectrum, where you say that religious fundamentalism equals unreason necessarily, I find that problematic. Specifically when you take into note, let's say, the Catholic Church, which is one of the largest organized religions, boasting over 1 billion members, and one of its mantras is faith and reason, where you can only properly approach faith by going through reason.
Thomas Aquinas.
Precisely.
Faith
So
is not unreasonable.
Exactly.
It just needs to be complemented by faith, which is why the highest way of life is not philosophy, but it's the first question Aquinas does in the Summa Theologica. Is philosophy the highest way of life? Very bold statement. But he says no. But to think that faith somehow is unreasonable, no, because if it was unreasonable, you'd be worshiping an unjust God.
Precisely.
No God can be unreasonable and demand that you sacrifice meat one day and vegetables the other, and and they both have to be done at the same time, but you're going to get damned for one. I mean, Aquinas is one of the most reasonable critics who looks at Aristotle as his mantra, which is completely right. Reason complemented by faith. But faith is not unreasonable, it just moves beyond it in a realm in which humans can't follow, precisely because we're humans.
Sure.
Yeah, let me respond. Yeah, I mean, and you're absolutely right. As to reemphasize what I tried to say initially, these are very crude definitions that even psychologists and sociologists of religion can't come to an agreement as to how you differentiate spirituality from religion, or how you even define religion even apart from the concept of spirituality. And you're right, there can be people who would claim to be spiritual, but they're very dogmatic, in which case they are basically have some sort of religious fundamentalism. And you can be very religious without being dogmatic, in the sense that you can be in the middle of this, and this sort of a mixture of reason and faith, like Aquinas. I mean, Aquinas is certainly a very intelligent person. So again, this is not an either-or. These are overgeneralizations just to stimulate the conversation and thinking about this. But you're certainly right.
Yeah, I guess I feel that the coupling of dogmatism and being unreasonable is not correct. I think you can be reasonable and dogmatic.
Yeah, I would disagree with that, because
So, I guess to clarify then, you would have to contest that there is no absolute? Because if there is an absolute, then you're perfectly reasonable in believing it.
Just a second. If A equals B, and B does not equal C, I'm dogmatic that A cannot equal C. I'm dogmatic about that.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just, anybody who wants to argue with me, fine, but I'm not going to relinquish that. That's dogmatic, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's completely reasonable. Reason
you're
is...
using a principle of reason, and I'm not arguing for relativism by any means.
Sure.
In fact, I have serious problems with relativism or moral relativism.
Sure.
But I don't think you need any sort of religious grounding to come up with, like, for example, these logical truths. Or you can look at the field of psychology, and it simply says, gee, if you're a drug addict, you're going to have an unhealthy way of living. And that's just a fact. And so, you don't need any sort of moral or religious absolute to say that pretty firmly, because the evidence and arguments indicate that. My definition is, as long as you're open to being wrong, as long as you are seriously open to the possibility that you're wrong about whatever it is you believe, and you're perfectly willing to say, if I'm confronted by evidence and arguments that outweigh my evidence and arguments for my belief, I'm perfectly willing to change. Then you're not dogmatic, you're not fundamentalist, and I have no problem with that.
I don't know that I would agree that makes you necessarily undogmatic. Because I think that you can approach a dogmatic belief with the ability, nonetheless, to be proven wrong. I mean, I dogmatically believe that I breathe oxygen and, my body respirates and all that, but if you can prove me wrong, then I'll still change my mind, but until that day, I dogmatically believe that.
Well, but see, then by my definition, I would say that that's not dogmatic. So I think we're just using different definitions of dogmatism.
Let's keep going.